All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our session. Especially thank you if you're anywhere near the Washington, D.C. area where we're having a beautiful spring afternoon today. So welcome. This is the 19th and Beyond, reflecting on the Suffrage Centennial and women's history in the National Park Service. My name is Ella Wagner. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm currently a Women's History Fellow with the Cultural Resources Office of Interpretation and Education, located in the Washington Support Office of the National Park Service. I'm beaming in today from Washington, D.C. Whoops, too far. Which sits on the ancestral lands of the Anacostan and Piscataway peoples. And this history feeling especially salient right now, as we just welcomed last week our new Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who's the first Indigenous Cabinet Secretary in US history. It's really exciting. So I'm really sorry that we can't all be together in person, but I'm very happy to have the privilege of bringing together this talented group of people to talk about compelling and inspiring work on women's history going on in the National Park Service. First, though, I want to let you all know that unfortunately one of our panelists, Kim Solinsky, who's a historian at Death Valley National Park, experienced a death in the family yesterday and is not able to join us today. I know she's really sorry not to be able to be here. I'm not going to try to present on her behalf, but I have left her slides in our presentation, and I'll do my best to give just a really brief summary of her incredible work, as well as her contact information if you want to get in touch with her. So sorry that Kim's not here, but moving forward, I'm just going to begin by introducing us as a group, doing a little bit to frame today's discussion. Then my fellow panelists are going to take turns to give really brief presentations of some of their recent work, introducing themselves as they go along. And then after these presentations, I'll ask a few thematic questions to the group for discussion, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion with the audience. But well as I can understand, you won't be able to unmute yourselves during this session, but please feel free to use the Zoom chat. We're going to save most questions till the end of the presentations, but since we have a large group here, if you want to type in something just so you don't forget it, I'll compile those to return to later in the Q&A. So as a brief introduction to us as a group, we are interns, former interns, fellows, contract workers, term employees, park guides, park rangers, working at National Park Service locations across the country who have done work, research, writing, interpretation, facilitation that explores women's history. While many of us have done this work in connection with the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment last year, others have been working on it long before that anniversary or for reasons that weren't really connected to the anniversary, as you'll hear. But we do think that the context of the anniversary is important, as in some ways it's acted as kind of a force multiplier for women's history work in the Park Service, bringing in institutional buy-in, leadership buy-in, public attention, staff time, and probably most importantly, funding to women's history work. And also explicitly encouraging NPS parks and programs to look for and share women's stories, even if those sites had no obvious connection to the suffrage movement. So in this discussion, the panelists are going to share some of the projects that they've worked on, their successes, some of the challenges and issues that came up. And they're going to consider what it would take and what it would mean for a diverse and inclusive women's history to remain a durable part of history in the National Park Service. This session is not intended to give kind of a bird's eye view of the whole 19th Amendment commemoration, but instead to kind of give a sense of, from the ground up of the ways that it's mattered across parks and programs. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass it over to our first speaker, Katie Crawford-Lackey.
Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Katie Crawford-Lackey, and I am a public historian by training. My pronouns are she and her, and I've been with the National Park Service, specifically the Cultural Resources Office of Interpretation and Education in Washington, D.C. for about 4.5 years now. And I think it's particularly important since the Park Service is a place-based agency to recognize that this land in Washington, D.C. was once home to the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples. Today, you'll be hearing from some of the other folks on this panel about the different ways in which the National Park Service commemorated the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And one of the important legacies of this work is that the momentum around women's history and suffrage has really continued beyond 2020, with parks and programs focusing more on women's stories as an integral part of American history. Next slide, please. And I had the opportunity to get involved in the commemoration very early on, around March or April of 2018. And I was working with the NPS National Coordinator of the 19th Amendment Centennial Commemoration, and I supported some of the initial digital planning and content development, specifically creating the Women's History website. And up until this point, there was not a whole lot of digital content on women's history in general on nps.gov, the agency website. And so this new women's history website was really intended to provide content, not just for the commemoration, but on women's history more generally. And it was supposed to highlight content that could be sustainable, not just through 2020, but for years down the line. So the site, as we built it, was intended to function as a platform where other park and program content could live. And it's also a place where the public can find a central place for all women's content in nps.gov. So again, it's really this place for both people within the agency, so an internal website where interpreters could find content, for example, but it's also a place where members of the public could find resources, events, educational material, all kinds of content about women's history in the National Park Service. And here's a slide of what the website looks like today. This is just a quick screenshot of what it is. And you can find the site at www.nps.gov/women's history. Next slide, please. And when I say that this women's history site was a place for women's history in the National Park Service, that doesn't just mean information about women in parks. This also means the history of women connected to properties listed in the National Register of Historic Places or designated as National Historic Landmarks, which are two programs managed by the National Park Service. So as a result, much of the content we researched and wrote about focused on the seemingly ordinary places connected to women's suffrage and women's history. So for example, the local courthouse where women in town cast their first ballots after the amendment passed, or maybe a park where suffragists protested and gave speeches. So all places that you're likely to find in your local community. And through this research, we hope to show that women's history is everywhere, even in your town or city. And this screenshot is a story map, an Esri story map we created for the commemoration. And it highlights one place in every state connected to women's suffrage. And this was just a great interactive way to demonstrate women's suffrage history is everywhere. And one of our main goals in building the website and associated tools like the story map was to sustain this focus on women's history and make it an integral part of every park and program beyond the commemoration. Next slide, please. We also recognize that traditional scholarship on women's suffrage movement in America often focused on the efforts of white middle to upper class women. And part of the Park Service's goal was to highlight lesser known stories of suffrage and not just include these stories, but really put them at the forefront of the movement. And this slide depicts one of the article series we created to achieve this goal. This series examines the African-American struggle for suffrage and the 15th Amendment, which enfranchised Black men. And the series also looks at how Black women were maligned from both the Black suffrage movement as well as the women's suffrage movement and their efforts to not only advance suffrage rights, but also all Black civil rights. Next slide, please. We also sought to communicate how nuanced the fight for suffrage was at both the federal and state level. Suffrage was not a right recognized nationally until 1920, but before that, a number of states and territories did recognize a women's right to vote. So for example, women in Utah gained access to the vote when it was a territory in 1870, but they lost it shortly thereafter because politicians were concerned about Mormon women voting. When the territory became a state in 1895, women once again had their suffrage rights recognized. So this fight for suffrage was not a linear process of progress, and it varied by state and territory. And that was something really integral into how we were telling these stories. And what you see on the slide here is a screenshot of the 19th Amendment by state feature on the Women's History website. And if you scroll down the page, you'll see a flag for every state, DC, and the territories. So we really tried to take paint with a broad brush as far as the stories we were telling. Next slide, please. And this is an example of what one of those state pages looks like. So this is the Utah state page. And we had a lot of help researching and writing these pages, since there were a lot of them. A lot of NPS interpreters, as well as interns and contractors, were really supportive of this work. Next slide, please. And for many women, the 19th Amendment did not guarantee their right to vote necessarily. And we wanted to make sure that we were telling stories of well-known suffragists as well as lesser-known suffragists. So here you'll see the 20 for 20 suffragist page that's on the Women's History website. And if you scroll down, you'll see even more people. And part of the effort behind this was that, the 19th Amendment did not guarantee the right to vote for all women. So African-American women, for example, faced intimidation and even violence at the polls. Native American women were not considered citizens until 1924 and were therefore denied access to the vote for another 5 years. Chinese American women did not benefit from the 19th Amendment until 1943, when the US government finally recognized their citizenship. And the examples go on and on. So our digital content needed to address the complicated process of demanding voting rights and the diverse women and men who participated in this process, even though some of them didn't immediately benefit from the amendment. So in moving beyond the commemoration, the Women's History site has continued to grow with new content due to the efforts of park interpreters, interns, and contractors. The site has been restructured and expanded since it was originally created in 2018. And you'll see wonderful new features such as Women of Public Health and Medicine or Women of the National Park Service. So really great new features. And the goal is for the website to continue to expand. And luckily, we have a really great group of interns who have worked for us in the past and continue to work for us that continue to create content. And I think the big message of the commemoration was that it served as a catalyst to raise awareness about the need to re-examine how we're telling stories. And it really forced at least myself and the other people I work with to reconsider making women's history an integral part of how we're telling American history. Thank you.
Thank you for setting me up there, Katie. I was a former intern with NPS. My name is Talia Brenner. I use she, her pronouns. I currently live in Boston on Pawtucket and Massachusetts ancestral land. And I'm currently a graduate student at Northeastern studying public history. So for most of 2020, I was an intern at the Cultural Resources Office of Interpretation and Education at NPS. And my internship was funded by NCPH, the National Council for Preservation Education. So there I was working with the Teaching with Historic Places program, and I'm going to be talking about a specific project I was working on during my internship. Could you go to the next page, please? So Teaching with Historic Places is an extensive collection of lesson plans coordinated by Interp and Ed. The lesson plans were written between the early 90s and the present. They're still being written. And they're written by a wide range of individuals, the vast majority of whom are outside of the Washington Support Office. They're written mostly at the middle school level, but can be graded up or down. So Teaching with Historic Places uses place-based learning. Each lesson plan is focused on a site that's either an NPS site or associated with NPS in some other way, for instance, on the National Register of Historic Places. So during my internship, I worked in assisting Katie Crawford-Lackey in migrating the corpus of lesson plans over to the new Park Service CMS. She did the vast majority of that work. But because I had experience in history curriculum writing for one of the projects for my internship, my supervisor, Barbara Little, had me take the opportunity to refresh and update some of the content a little bit in the context of the 19th Amendment Centennial. So within Teaching with Historic Places, there are plenty of lesson plans that are all women's history, but there were also a lot that had women's history content in them, but it wasn't the main focus. So what I did was I excerpted some lesson plans that were not on the face about women's history, but contained women's stories in them. And I sort of spun them around so that the women's stories were foregrounded. And this practically had the effect that they could be listed with all of the women's history content that we were creating for the website. We called this new lesson plan series Women's History to Teach Year-Round, which is a little cheeky commentary on not only teaching women's history during Women's History Month. So this project served the additional goal of making some of the Teaching with Historic Places content, which is excellent in its original form, but is really, really long, just making it a little bit more digestible. The lesson plans, especially the early ones, are days and days worth of content. Katie Crawford-Lackey had conducted a study of teachers who were using Teaching with Historic Places in their classrooms. And she found that one of the needed updates to the series was just to make them shorter and easier to use. Now, I was working on this project during the spring and summer of 2020, where the pandemic was making external research very difficult. But the way that the project was structured, I was able to really make use of what we had within the lesson plan series to make use of that content with relatively little additional research. I did do some. And I should say that this Women's History to Teach Year-Round series was edited and built upon after the end of my internship by Katie McCarthy, another NCPH intern, for which I'm very grateful. Could you go to the next slide, please? So on the right here, you can see a Teaching with Historic Places lesson plan, an original one, which is all about school desegregation in New Kent County, Virginia. One of the primary sources in this lesson is an oral history interview with the Reverend Dr. Cynthia Lewis Gaines, who was one of the first Black students to attend the formerly all-white New Kent school in the late 1960s. The interview with her was really one source among many in the lesson plan. So what I did here was pull out the interview and made that the focus of a new lesson plan, which you can see on the left here, the first steps of desegregation, Reverend Dr. Cynthia Lewis Gaines remembers. So I revised the introduction materials to provide helpful context, but to focus the lesson more on Dr. Gaines' specific experiences. And then I rewrote discussion questions and classroom activities accordingly. So we get a much shorter lesson plan that's probably about an hour in length, and it's centered on women's experiences. And then on the website, we can, in good faith, call it Women's History. So I did this with 11 different lesson plans. A lot of what I learned from this project was very specific to Teaching with Historic Places and the particular situation we found ourselves in with the NPS website migration and the 19th Amendment Centennial and COVID. But I've definitely taken from this work a reaffirmation that women's history is everywhere, but it often takes significant reframing to show it. The Dr. Gaines example is relatively straightforward. Her oral history interview was a primary source for students to analyze in the original lesson plan. But in other lesson plans that I excerpted for this series, women's and girls' experiences were even more concealed behind male protagonists. And they were usually described only in relation to men. And those lesson plans definitely took more work. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Jade Ryerson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm a senior studying public history at DePaul University in Chicago. I'm currently on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Ottawa nations. The Sauk, Fox, Miamia, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee have also called this area home. I started working with the Cultural Resources Office of Interpretation and Education as a virtual student federal service intern back in September of 2019. I've continued working with the office as a National Council for Preservation Education intern since June of 2020. So all of my experience working with the Park Service has been entirely remote, even before the pandemic. But it's still been really amazing to contribute to the 19th Amendment Centennial and do rewarding public history work without ever setting foot in Washington. Next slide, please. Okay, so much of my work has supported the 19th Amendment Centennial. I was really interested in delving into the stories of suffragists who were people of color or part of the LGBTQ community. For my project, I researched and authored a number of articles about the places where suffragists traveled, protested, and made history, which we have dubbed Places of Articles. Most of the sites, structures, and historic districts that are highlighted in those articles are listed in the National Register of Historic Places. You can find many of those Places of articles featured on the story section of the Travel Women's History site, and I've included the banner image of that website here. Each article usually features at least 5 places that are associated with events and actions from the suffragist life. For example, one of the thumbnails that you can see here is for the places of Mabel Pinghua Lee. Lee rode on horseback in 1912 in the Women's Suffrage Parade in New York City when she was just 16 years old. She eventually became the first Chinese American woman to earn her PhD in economics from Columbia University. Another example that I've provided is for the places of Zikalasa. She was a Yankton Sioux musician, writer, and political activist. She and her husband also established the National Council of American Indians back in 1926. Because all of the work that I've done has been remote, I faced many of the research challenges that Talia just mentioned. But my status as an undergraduate student has actually been really fortuitous on that end, because I've been able to access databases and digital collections through my university. But doing a fully virtual internship has also made me a lot more resourceful and creative when it comes to thinking about research materials at my disposal and demonstrating how the public can connect women's history to Park Service sites, especially because I've never been to most of those places myself. Okay, so now that you have an idea of the products, let's talk about the process. Next slide, please. So I tried to illustrate my approach through the diagram on this slide. I'll often start by reviewing scholarship about a suffragist's life to find events or things that they've done that fit with the appropriate theme, in this case, suffrage, and have a National Park Service connection. That's often the most challenging part. A lot of the time, the official historical significance of the sites that I end up choosing does not pertain to suffrage, let alone women's history in general. To give you an example, I picked the places of Ida B. Wells. Wells was an African-American journalist, feminist, and an early leader in the civil rights movement. She's well known for her anti-lynching activism, which is where the first Beale Street Church comes in. The church hosted the offices of the Men for Free Speech, and as a journalist for that newspaper, Wells wrote a scathing expose of a lynching at a local grocery store. As a result, local whites lashed out, ransacked the office, and destroyed the printing equipment. So from the diagram, hopefully you can see my thought process by following the arrows. I started with Wells's life, and I identified events that speak to the kind of work that she's done. And then I researched sites listed in the National Register that could be associated with those events. So for her anti-lynching activism, I found the Beale Street Church. And for her civil rights activism, I might have picked a different site where she gave a speech. So then I repeat that process until I end up with a full places of article. Some of the other sites that I chose for the places of Ida B. Wells have a much more direct connection to suffrage, such as Pennsylvania Avenue National Historic Site, which was the location of the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C. But by selecting sites that aren't directly related to suffrage, I hope to show that, one, the suffrage movement didn't exist in a vacuum. Suffragists were often involved with other movements and activities that informed their work, and therefore, two, that women's history is everywhere. In fact, women's history is American history, not adjacent to it. Because of that, we've continued to use this places of format to tell more stories, such as the places of women's labor activism in Chicago and the places of hidden figures, which is about Black women mathematicians and aeronautics in the space race. Next slide, please. So I'll end my time with another women's history places of article, one that isn't connected to suffrage, but definitely conveys women's history as American history. Here we have a few of the sites that I selected for the article, Places of Katherine Lee Bates in America the Beautiful. As you might have guessed from the title, Katherine Lee Bates wrote the poem America the Beautiful. You know the one, oh beautiful for spacious skies, but I'll spare you from any more serenading from me. Bates was also a professor of English at Wellesley College and a life partner of 25 years to another Wellesley professor, Katherine. As I reviewed the story of how Bates wrote the song, I realized that a lot of the lyrics referred to places that directly related to events in her own life. So on this slide, I provided a few screenshots from some of those places. Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas for amber waves of grain, Jackson Park Historic Landscape District in Midway Plaisance in Chicago, which refers to Thine Alabaster City's Gleam from the lesser known later verse, and of course, Pikes Peak National Historic Landmark. Standing at the top of Pikes Peak, Bates looked out, saw the purple mountain majesties, and was inspired to write America the Beautiful. So I'll leave you with the question we included at the top of the Places of Katherine Lee Bates article. What do you find inspiring about your surroundings? My guess is there's probably a women's history connection there somewhere. You just have to look for it. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion portion.
Hey, Rezi, I think you're on mute.
Thank you for telling me. Hi, everyone. My name is Rezi Palixa, and my pronouns are they, them. And I'm a park ranger at Lowell National Historical Park in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is on unceded Abenaki territory, home of the Pennacook and Pawtucket peoples. And I want to respectfully acknowledge that my work here would not be possible without those who have and who continue to steward the lands and waters I am on today. Next slide, please. So I'm here in Lowell. A lot of people hear Lowell, Massachusetts, and they might think about mills, the Industrial Revolution, mill girls, etc. So what you see here on the screen is an excerpt from our website, as well as photos of one of our exhibit spaces, the Blue Cotton Mills Museum. The exterior is on the left, and the historic weave room factory floor is on the right. Next slide, please. So the Industrial Revolution is the story that we tell, but we know that the Industrial Revolution is not just a one-time thing, it's a big sweeping phenomenon, and there's a lot of stories within that title. So this is a map of our complete park area. It might be hard to see, but we have 4 museum exhibit spaces that are in orange. And you'll also notice that there's a lot of space on this map, which reflects our historic downtown and historic residential neighborhoods. The park is really embedded in the city landscape of Lowell. It includes 5.5 miles of historically engineered canals, as well as the Merrimack River. So I'm including this map to show you that as a park, we navigate a lot of different expectations and visitor interests related to Lowell, related to the city, related to the Industrial Revolution. And we also, those interests vary depending on whether we're thinking of our local audience, who is incredibly diverse. Lowell is notably home to the 2nd largest community of Cambodians and Cambodian Americans in the country. But there are also sizable Latinx and Black communities. And Lowell is a designated refugee resettlement area by the federal government. So our city continues to grow and to change. So that is an incredibly rich audience who we love working with. And then we also, as a national park site, are concerned about our larger quote unquote national audience, audiences who are traveling, visiting us on vacation. So that indicates that they can afford to travel, they can afford to go on vacation. Audiences who might be older or retired, or who are traveling with their kids looking for something to do. This audience does not necessarily super local. They're coming from out of town, out of state, even internationally. Next slide, please. So for this out-of-town audience, they know us for the Industrial Revolution. In many cases, they know about the mill girls. This slide has a historic photo of some of the mill girls who worked in the factories, as well as some images from our Mill Girls exhibit, which is located in a historic boarding house. So I am a park ranger, I'm a frontline interpreter. I have had a lot of conversations in that boarding house space with these out-of-town kind of national audience visitors who seem to understand the Mill Girls as like a monolithic entity. They see that we have a line of exhibit text that talks about the Mill Girls had free time at the end of their day, which could be used to entertain male visitors in the boarding house. And so I've often seen and observed visitors read that, and then they start to get this like spark in their eye of romantic intrigue in the boarding house or something. And when this detail is taken to its furthest assumption, it means that all the Mill Girls, when they left Lowell, left to get married, which is not true. We know that's not true. So for this group of out-of-town kind of national audience, I'd say our interpretation of the complex and nuanced Mill Girl story on the face of our exhibitry alone is oversimplified and definitely could stand to be updated. On the other hand, with our local community members, we've heard very often from them that the Mill Girl story isn't one that they resonate with anymore. They've heard the story over and over if they've grown up in Lowell, and they want to hear new content from us that feels more relevant and more connected. Next slide, please. So as someone in this park who is a queer historian and is interested in LGBTQ history and gender history, I noticed a lack of any queer representation or possibility of queerness in our Mill Girl story. This slide is of Lucy Larcom, who is maybe the most famous Mill Girl. She wrote a lot, she had a prolific literary career, and she left a lot of written records. So we rely on Lucy heavily in our interpretation of the Mill Girl story. I could talk about Lucy forever, and I have before, so I want to be mindful of time. But she's included in this presentation because while she's one of the most well-known Mill Girls, as a queer historian looking into her writings, I found letters and journal entries that point towards some degree of queerness in her story. And she's a 19th century figure, so we can't ascribe, hard labels onto her. But in learning this about her, she became kind of a central figure for us in the park when we began doing LGBTQ history interpretation around. So I'd be happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. Next slide, please. We also wanted to take our 19th Amendment interpretation beyond the connection to the Mill Girls. So on the left is Harriet Hanson Robinson, who was a Mill Girl. She became a suffragist who was associated with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. But of course, we know that Stanton and Anthony are not the be-all, end-all of the suffrage story. So when doing my research, I wanted to find a model who could be more inclusive or more radical in suffrage organizing. So that led me to Florence Luscombe, who is here on the right. The rightmost photo is actually of her visiting the Grand Canyon. So we even have a connection to a more natural park too. But Luscombe was born in Lowell, and she was much more radical as a suffragist and an activist. And I think Luscombe provides a really great example of white allyship in activism. And so that is how we've kind of talked about her in our interpretation of this complex 19th Amendment split that happens in the movement. Next slide, please. So in terms of our programming, we tried to meet those two audiences, our local and our more out-of-town national audience. When COVID happened, a lot of our offerings ended up online. So we created a Women's Activism in Lowell series on our website, which is what you see on the screen right now, are some screenshots from that part of our website. And that really goes in depth to the Mill Girls, into the complications of the Mill Girl story and the 19th Amendment story. And this sort of really meets kind of the national audience questions. Next slide, please. But to also make that offering a little more locally relevant, part of that website is a series we have called Mill City Minutes. So these are brief 1-minute videos. We did a series exploring 5 local women activists. Some were more historic and some were more recent. None of them are connected to suffrage, but they're different examples of the forms that women's activism can take. So the ones on this slide, Betsy Cornwell and Deolinda Mello, are stories that are not as told or celebrated as often as they could or should be. So this was a start for us in telling their stories. Betsy Cornwell was a free Black woman in Lowell who set up a boarding house for other free Black people living in the city. And the location of her boarding house later became the location of a Jewish and African-American neighborhood. And Deolinda Mello, who you also see, worked tirelessly on behalf of immigrants and refugees in Lowell in our kind of more recent past. Next slide, please. So from the outset of planning our activities for 19th Amendment was community engagement. Working with our local community is just something we do in Lowell. We are a member of a city, and so community engagement with partner organizations is something that's really important to us. So these are some examples. 2019 was a local election year for the city of Lowell, so we hosted a panel and community conversation with local voting activists in the city. And in 2020, before COVID, we organized with the local Register of Deeds, who is a local historian. He has a great local following. We worked with him to organize a series of walks called Lowell Walks. Each walk is led by a community expert in a different topic. So part of my work here at the park is being on the organizing committee of something called Lowell Women's Week, which is a celebration of women in the community every March. And last March, we were able to do one Lowell walk before COVID hit. And it was on women's activism in Lowell. And it was co-led between the park and the founders of Lowell Women's Week, who shared some of their photos and their stories and of activism and organizing. Next slide, please. I also want to add that being a community engaged park means being responsive to what's happening around you. So in 2017, a group of residents of color filed a Voting Rights Act lawsuit against the city of Lowell. The system of electing city council in Lowell is Massachusetts Plan E government, which has been shown to disadvantage communities of color from gaining representation. So in 2016, you can kind of see in the bottom of the screen here a screenshot. Commonwealth Magazine ran this article titled "Why Whites Control Lowell City Government." And I have included a brief timeline of access to representation in city council. So this is very reflective of the larger story of suffrage and representation we see in the United States. Here in Lowell, we get representation first accomplished by white women in 1935 and 1964, but it wasn't for a really long time after that that there was any representation of people of color on the local city council. So that was in 1999 with the election of Riti Ong. But until today, there has been no woman of color elected to city council in Lowell. And it's not for lack of trying. So this is where the park fits in. On the right is an example of one of our interpretive projects over 2020. So in Massachusetts in 1915, there was a referendum to allow women to vote. The referendum didn't pass, but the more interesting part is that the logo for this effort was a bluebird. So we took a cue from that bluebird. My colleague, Allison Horrocks, kind of worked with a team of seasonals to create suffrage tweets with a bluebird here. And we reached out to women-owned businesses in the downtown area to see if they would like to hang up these suffrage tweet posters in their windows to kind of interest their customers. And so this particular tweet addresses the representation of people of color in Lowell City Council with the story of Bertie Malbury, who is another really amazing figure. Again, I could go on at length and I'll try to stop. But this tweet tells the story of her running for city council each election cycle between 1979 1989. She never won. Her election office was vandalized with arson, but she was the first woman of color and the first Black person to qualify on the ballot for Lowell City Council. So we wanted to get that story out there because given the election climate and given this conversation around voting access in the city, her story felt really important to bring out at that moment. And this is just one way that we share it. So I look forward to talking with you all more in the Q&A. I'm really trying to stop myself short right now, but thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Porsha Dossie. I use she, her pronouns. I am a staff historian in the Park History Program at WASO, also known as the Washington Support Office. I am originally from Miami, which resides on ancestral Tequesta and Seminole lands, but currently live and work in DC on Anacostan and Piscataway land. In my current position at the National Park Service, I am the program historian, essentially a program manager for the African American Civil Rights Network, which is what I will be discussing today. Next slide, please. So you may be asking yourself, what is the African American Civil Rights Network? We are a relatively new program to the National Park Service. I think the most recent might be the Reconstruction era network, but we're the second, I guess. And I really want to talk to you all about this because the work that the Civil Rights Network has been attempting to do very much fits in with the 19th Amendment commemoration, though we did begin this work a bit before that. So the network has been around since 2018. It was signed into law by the previous administration, and then we finally opened to the public in 2019. So this image is of Gloria Richardson. She may be one of my favorite civil rights figures of all time. And we wanted to choose this image and use this image in our brochure, which is what this is a screenshot of, because I think a lot of civil rights narratives tend to focus on great race men such as Dr. King. And we wanted to, as a program, emphasize the role of Black women in the struggle for freedom. Next slide, please. So the reason we, and when I say we are very small, but my team, it's myself as program historian and Dr. Kelly Spradley-Karowski, who's our national coordinator. We were met with, and I'll get into this probably a little bit later, but when we talk about some of the struggles we face in doing this work, I would be remiss in saying that the previous administration was very supportive. I don't think that's wholly accurate. I think they had an understanding of civil rights history that very much is a really common understanding. I think it's what a lot of us are really taught, which is that the civil rights movement was a story of linear progress, in that essentially Dr. King died for our nation's sins, and we are redeemed from the horrors of chattel slavery and Jim Crow, and none of that is true. And so I think when you are presenting folks with a history that they're not familiar with, there's that resistance, and we try to figure out ways as a program to navigate that, and it's especially hard when leadership, when you're trying to convince leadership. And so we found other ways to kind of navigate that relationship and present this really comprehensive understanding of the civil rights movement that includes women, femmes, gender nonconforming folks, queer folks, youth, geographic diversity. So that's kind of what I'll get into in a bit here. Next slide, please. So the Civil Rights Network is a commemorative program. And so we are looking to, between now and the time that we sunset in 2024, to add properties, facilities, and programs to the network. And they can come to our network in one of three ways. So through congressional action, through a Secretary of Interior proclamation, or through our public application process. And that is all from the enabling legislation, which is the African American Civil Rights Act of 2017. But our key values come from our program, myself and Kelly, in determining really what we want this program to be about and how we want to cultivate relationships with our stakeholders and the public. And so our first value, national in scope. The civil rights movement goes beyond the Deep South. Racism is an ongoing scourge that we continue to face today, and that happens in Miami, it happens in Rhode Island, it happens in Alaska. So we want to make sure that we're really having that conversation and acknowledging this history. Inclusive. So the contributions of women, gender nonconforming folks, youth, having this conversation that separates our obsession with Dr. King and Rosa Parks, who Rosa Parks has such a amazing radical history that has all all but been erased in a lot of ways. And so we're trying to bring that narrative from the margin into the center through our commemorative efforts. Also relevancy. So we had some pushback initially when we used some language about the ongoing Black freedom struggle. There was a feeling that, well, the civil rights movement ended, what is the ongoing struggle? And trying to explain that to someone who has a life experience where maybe they're not necessarily impacted by racism was a learning experience for me as I began this work. But we want to serve as a bridge between the past and our current movements for freedom. And I think that's what separates us from other commemorative programs, because the act of commemoration is essentially, I think I wrote that, I'm going to look at my notes and be a professional. But I think commemoration is used to create and sanction public meanings of historical events as it impacts our national identity. So when we talk about the civil rights movement, it is that narrative of Rosa Parks sat on a bus, Dr. King died. That's why we all can hold hands and be colorblind. And that is just not accurate. And so we want to present a history of the civil rights movement that shows that that progress was not linear, that battles were won, battles were lost, and that fight really continues to today. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the geographic diversity of the network, we're still struggling. We are a new program. And it's my hope by talking to you all today that maybe there are sites in your area that you think would be a good fit for the program so that we can keep those key values going. But currently, and this is actually slightly out of date, but we are now in 17 states. Our newest additions, I believe, are South Carolina, Virginia, and Oregon. And these are properties, facilities, and programs. So properties are, the built structure. A facility is a museum, an archive, and programs are a little more nebulous. It can be a interpretive dance, it can be a website, it can be a nonprofit. So there are a lot of ways to access membership to the Civil Rights Network. Next slide, please. Some of our sites include, I think, historical resources that you all are probably more familiar with, such as the 16th Street Baptist Church, where those 4 young girls were murdered in Birmingham, Alabama. You all may not be as familiar with A.P. Tureau. He was an NAACP lawyer from New Orleans, Louisiana, who helped desegregate the schools in New Orleans during his lifetime. Our most recent addition, I don't know if that's on here, but I would want to talk a bit about Medgar and Murley Evers Home National Monument. That's now our 423rd National Park Unit, but before it became a park unit, it was on the network through legislative action. And what I love about the Medgar and Murley Evers home is that they could have just called it the Medgar Evers House or the Medgar Evers Home, and instead, historic preservationists fought to include Murley Evers in the title as well, because she was just as much of a civil rights figure as her husband. And it goes to show that Black women, particularly those working in local grassroots history, are really doing the work to amplify the voices of our foremothers. And I really like that. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we did not really begin this work as a result of the commemoration for the 19th Amendment. We had kind of started these projects before then, but I want to touch on some of the work that we are doing. So yes, we're managing a program that's about connecting the National Park Service with local historical resources, but we also are charged with, through our enabling legislation, to educate the public on civil rights history. One of the ways we are attempting to do that is historic context statements. So this is picking maybe a theme or an event to focus on and synthesize that information. And in my case, I'm working on a Women in the Civil Rights Movement historic context study that's broken into 3 parts. We currently have one on the Green Book. I'm also working on one about the Black campus movement as well as Rosenwald schools. But I chose to focus today on the women in the civil rights movement to kind of discuss why that work is so needed, particularly as we try to get sites that focus on Black women's history onto the network. My other role is updating the civil rights subject site for the National Park Service. We have some great stuff on there. I think the work that particularly contingent labor has done has been the bulk of that work, and I'll talk a bit about that before I wrap this up. But the sustainability of keeping this work in the digital sphere alive is going to come down to not just us hiring interns and myself as a term employee. There really needs to be a sustainable effort to permanently keep people on so that they continue to do this work. In my role, I have really struggled to finish updating the civil rights subject site as things kind of get thrown at me. But by the end of the year, I'm hoping to complete a people asset in our content management software on Merle Evers and Polly Murray. We're also continuing to identify significant properties associated with underrepresented figures, and we may be getting funding to complete a podcast, so stay tuned. Next slide. So the first of the historic context statements for women in the civil rights movement focuses on Ella Baker, Dorothy Height, Septima Ponsett Clark, and Mamie Lou Hamer. I want to be mindful of time, so I will not go into these wonderful women, but if you're interested in reading the context statement, it will be up in the next few weeks, and I'm happy to share that link at a later time. Next slide. So the purpose of these context statements is really twofold. So the first is to educate the public on an often underrepresented aspect of civil rights history, but also to assist applicants by providing the necessary historical information and guidance for them to apply to the network. So what we've noticed is that a lot of folks who are applying to the Civil Rights Network are not public historians or historic preservationists by any means. Like, they are really just your average person who learned about our program and thought it was kind of neat, and they're interested in maybe getting grants and other technical assistance that we offer. And so we wanted to make applying for the network as accessible as possible. So now that they can use these context statements, cite those in their application, and then they now have a verifiable connection to the civil rights movement that our enabling legislation asks for, and they're on the network, and it's that simple. So this is really about making this work accessible to the public. Next slide, please. So again, wanting to be mindful of time, I really want to share this video. So I don't know how many of you saw 20 and Odd. It came out February 2020 in honor of Black History Month. Our former American Conservation Experience fellow, Radajan Moore, is one of the folks who helped script this, film it, create it. And I wanted to show this because it also does display some of our wonderful resources that are on the Civil Rights Network, as well as National Park Service sites. And I think it's important to note that these were 5 Black interns and fellows who had experienced some things while working in the National Park Service, and would tell their friends like, oh yeah, I'm interning at the National Park Service. And they're like, oh, Black people do stuff there? They care about Black people? And that's something I've also experienced when I tell people I work for the National Park Service. And so they thought creating something like this would show people that Black folks have every right to outdoor recreational spaces, and that these lands also belong to us. And the fact that it took interns, really advocating for this work, and they are the ones doing this work, as we go back to talking about contingent labor, how the bulk of what sounds like all of us have experiences kind of leading this charge. None of us are GS 15s, 14s, or 13s, or supervisors. And I think for this work to be durable, for it to be sustainable, we need to go where the money resides. We need to be hired long-term. We need to be offered permanent positions for this field to continue. And I think watching how beautiful and moving 20 and Odd is, you see, like, just imagining what else they could do if they could be kept on in a longer capacity. It's just something to think about. But I want to again be mindful so that Elizabeth can do her wonderful presentation. So hopefully if there's time, I can play this video during the Q&A portion. So thank you, everyone. That is my time.
Okay, thank you, Porsha, and hopefully we'll be able to get back to that in the Q&A. And just in case not, if you could add that link to the chat, that would be fantastic. So we make sure that that doesn't get lost. As I said at the top of the presentation, one of our great panelists, Kim Selinsky, had a family emergency and was not able to join us today. I cannot present in her place, but I wanted to make sure that her contribution was here. And I just wanted to summarize really quickly what she was going to talk about, so that that information is out there. Her fantastic work doesn't go unrecognized. So just quickly, Kim is a women's history contractor at Death Valley National Park, working on Timbisha Shoshone homeland. Death Valley is known primarily as a nature park, so visitors don't necessarily arrive expecting to hear historical information, which can present a challenge for interpreters of history. Often though, when a historical narrative is presented, as Kim put it succinctly, it focuses on a story of white people lost in the desert that represents only one facet of the area's history. So Kim's research focused on identifying women in the history of Death Valley, compiling existing research and conducting new research, and then producing a binder of information on women of Death Valley in consultation with park interpreters. Ongoing and future projects are going to include oral histories of Timbisha Shoshone women and digital content for the park's website and app in hopes of engaging more visitors with historical content when they visit the park. Kim's contact information will be at the end of the presentation. And we're very sorry, she really wished she could be here today. But I think our next presenter, Elizabeth Villano from Muir Woods National Monument, can speak a little bit more on some of the themes that Kim had intended to talk about historical interpretation in parks that are usually visited for natural resources. Sorry,
Thank
so
you,
these are just
Ella.
some examples of Kim's work.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth. I'm a park guide at Muir Woods National Monument, and I use she, her pronouns. So Muir Woods is the ancestral home of the Huiman Coast Miwok people. Currently, I'm on the unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, where I am in San Francisco right now, presenting to you all. So Muir Woods National Monument is a redwood forest just an hour north of San Francisco. And you can see redwoods depicted in the image behind me, my virtual background, as well as that image on the far right of the world's tallest living trees, the coast redwoods. Because we're so close to San Francisco, that image on the left, you can see the red dot just north of the Golden Gate Bridge of San Francisco. We get a lot of people. We are on the Travelocity list of top 10 things to do in San Francisco. So people come not fully understanding what to expect. We have a really diverse audience, which is something I really value about working at Muir Woods and something I resonated with Resi when they were talking about being embedded in a city landscape. We're not so much embedded in a city landscape, but we do get people who don't normally seek out national parks because of that prominence. When people come to Muir Woods National Monument, they expect to learn about redwood trees. They expect to learn about ecology, and definitely are not looking for history. They're not really looking, if they are looking for history, not looking for diverse and inclusive history, which is what we strive towards. So Ella, if you could go to the next slide. The people depicted on the screen are, well, they have something in common. On the far left, there's John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt in that iconic image of them at Yosemite National Park. In the center, it's Gifford Pinchot, the first head of the US Forest Service. And on the far right is William Kent, who is a prominent figure in the Muir Woods story and a politician who some of you might know as pushing forward legislation for the Organic Act that helped make the National Park Service, or you might know him for his work in anti-Asian exclusion laws in the early 1900s. What do these four men have in common? First of all, they are men. Second of all, they're all white. Third of all, they have a lot of prominence behind their names. Many of them have wealth and status. And then John Muir, as we know, has a lot of status, maybe not as much wealth. So the old story that we used to tell at Muir Woods National Monument up until I would say about 2017 or 2018 is that John Muir inspired William Kent to preserve a place like Muir Woods, which was threatened by logging. So William Kent, being a savvy politician, turned to his friend Gifford Pinchot, who he had met at Yale Forestry School. And together they convinced Theodore Roosevelt to accept the donation of Muir Woods to become a national monument, which it is today, and it was saved from logging. So if we could fast forward to the next slide. During the pandemic, many of us, myself included, realized we had a lot of time on our hands when Muir Woods shut down for several months. Unlike some of the previous panelists who talked about the challenge of the pandemic in terms of research, for me, it was an opportunity. I am generally a frontline interpretive specialist, meaning I don't have a lot of time to dig into these historical resources. Also, it's not something I've been trained in, so it felt like a large barrier. But when the pandemic hit and I had months and months of time to research, Ella and I collaborated to ask this question of, did a women's movement help save Muir Woods? And the image you see on the right is this beautiful old-timey picture of these women in these big gowns with an old school car that says "Save the Redwoods," and you can see a redwood tree in the far background. So the research that we did concluded, yes, absolutely, women helped save Muir Woods. So our research disrupted that dominant narrative I told you earlier that Muir Woods was saved by rich, powerful white men. Turns out that women were the first large grassroots movement, and I say that with a little bit of quotes because these women were largely white and upper class, but they were restricted in their power and their right to vote. They were the first grassroots movement that helped save redwood forests like Muir Woods. And that article you can see right next to the women who saved the redwoods, the title is "The Ladies Want Redwoods Saved." So next slide. But we started asking ourselves, we're talking a lot about white women. Was our story inclusive? And when we were just looking at white women, was it because only white women were interested in this fight? Or was there more nefarious things underfoot? And I think those of us who have studied public history recognize that it is usually the latter, that things were afoot. So this image you see on the right is a newspaper article called "Colored Line in Women's Clubs." Mrs. Lovell White, who was the head of the California Club who helped lead that movement to save Muir Woods, resigns as a result of action favorable to Negroes. So the women who helped save Muir Woods, they were composed of mostly white upper class women who I mentioned before. They intentionally excluded women of color from joining this movement to help save places like Muir Woods. So learning that, our question evolved to be, and then Ella, you can hit next. Did Black women's clubs join the forestry or conservation movement? Why or why not? And if not, what other forms did Black women's activism take, especially in the environmental sphere? And being centered right by San Francisco, we are right across the bay from Oakland, California, which was a hub of Black activism, specifically Black women's activisms, especially with the Fannie Perkins Club. So we can go to the next slide. And I could talk about that for a while, but I wanna be respectful of time. Feel free to ask me more questions in the Q&A. Ella and I put together a resource, a webinar called Sharing Untold Stories, where we went out to parks and we encouraged them, what are the untold stories in your park? And if you do have women's history, is it centering just white women, or can we expand it from beyond there? So Ella put together this great list of how to start asking these questions and how to start doing this resource. We have a PDF available of this if anyone's interested. My contact information is in the chat. As well as we put together this hour-long webinar where we used Muir Woods as a case study, but more so talked about how to start telling inclusive history. And that webinar is recorded on YouTube, which I'm also happy to share if you send me an email. So Ella, next slide. I want to end by saying that at Muir Woods, we got, that hunk of time that I got to research during the pandemic. I know that's not realistic for a lot of folks who are on the front lines like me. I don't expect to have a chance to really dig into the research like that moving forward. But I want to highlight the work that my coworker Stephanie is doing right now, where she's saying, okay, rather than just looking at the women who helped save a place like Muir Woods and this larger environmental activism that was happening at the time, what women helped influence the way that we understand Muir Woods National Monument. So the image on the right of the screen is a part of a pop-up or a temporary exhibit that she put together about women scientists throughout time who helped influence the way that we understand ecology, plate tectonics. So the woman who's highlighted here is Marie Tharp. But we have a whole range in Gambit, which is just such an interesting way to think about isolation in park sites. And I think sometimes park employees think my resource is right here around me. But we are a part of a larger ecosystem where there's a lot of research going in and a lot of scientists who are contributing to the field. And so if you're having trouble finding whatever underrepresented group that you want to uplift and show leadership within, you don't have to just stay focused in your park. You can also look for influential figures in the field. So just encouraging you folks to look for broader messaging of the women or non-binary folks or men or any demographic that you feel is underrepresented at your site who increase that understanding of your field. And with that, I will turn it over to Ella for some thematic questions.
All right, thank you so much to all our panelists for these fascinating presentations. And thanks to those of you who have put questions into the Q&A function. We're gonna ask a few sort of thematic questions first, and then I'm gonna get to those which are a bit more specific to some of the things that people have talked about. But if you have more questions as we're speaking that you think of, you can put them in the chat, in the Q&A function. We'd love to hear from you. I believe we have some time, so I'm excited for a bit of a discussion. So I want to start first by asking something that several of us have touched on. Oops. Hold on. In the course of talking about this, which is this question about the COVID-19 pandemic. We've all been working under very unusual circumstances. And I'm curious to know about in what ways the pandemic affected your projects and what you've learned that might be relevant for future work, hopefully conducted under non-public health crisis conditions.
I'll say something. So I was a NCPH and an ACE fellow. So I was lucky enough that I in person got to meet my now colleagues, but my entire term position has been working remotely due to the pandemic. And I think that's created some issues as far as being able to go to archives and complete research. I'm really dependent on just kind of ordering books and JSTOR in a lot of ways, which I think many of us are probably facing. So I would say that as well, thinking about our strategic partnerships, we had some things lined up with the University of Maryland and the University of Mary Washington that we were no longer able to do, as well as the Association for African American History had a event with them where we were going to kind of connect some of our AACR resources so that they could get to know one another, and that just unfortunately was not possible. So.
And I'll add that I touched on this earlier, but something that I think the pandemic taught me as a park guide was that it's really important to give people time to research these stories. Because if you expect people to start talking about them, but you have no resources about it, then you can't share all of American history, which is what the National Park Service is, what we are supposed to do. So definitely dedicating time or amazing resources. Ella was instrumental in helping me. I can't imagine having done it without her. Making sure that people like Ella are full-time and permanent and can help parks, and people like me who are flounder a little bit without assistance.
Cool. So we'll just move on to another question. And Elizabeth, you touched on this a little bit, and I was hoping that Kim would be here to talk about this, but you're going to have to stand in, I think. But I'm curious about, so one of the issues that a lot of folks face working in the National Park Service is not necessarily the expectation of visitors when they visit certain parks that are more known for natural resources to encounter history. So I'm curious if you could talk a little more about how, maybe what some of the reactions have been to some of this research, or what strategies you might use to kind of engage with those visitor expectations when you are trying to share historical content.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in our early days of sharing history, we'd brand it differently. We'd say, like, do you want to go on a women's history walk? Do you want to go on a tree talk or a 15-minute talk that specializes in history? And I think that sets up expectations as well as pushes people away who might be interested, who don't think that they're interested in a history walk. So I would say from the get-go, infusing that as much into your site resource as possible. And I think natural resources and historical resources have such a natural tie that we oftentimes ignore and don't pursue. And so now in all of my programs, I talk about women's history because that's Muir Woods history. And I'm a park guide who interprets Muir Woods, not just the ecology of Muir Woods. And so I would say that kind of reframing the way we think about this and kind of taking away that artificial separation is a really important component. But I would also say that people did react negatively to our programs, and they continue to react negatively to our programs, and that's okay. I think if they weren't reacting negatively, I would start to question, am I telling a complete story? Because that pushback almost reaffirms that the work we're doing is important and it's on the leading edge of things. And so I think as a person who has received both positive comments and negative comments about the work we're doing, grounding myself in the positive ones and taking the negative ones as an affirmation to move forward.
That's great. And that really kind of goes into the next question that I wanted to ask, which is just the role of visitor expectations or audience expectations. So, not only in parks, but also, expectations around digital content or however, or whatever forms our work's taken. So if others want to jump in to talk about like how you have, thought about expectations in terms of doing work or designing programs or research, and then the ways that those have played out when you've shared your work or when you've collaborated with partners, that would be great to hear more about.
I feel like I could talk a lot about this, which is like the park ranger answers everything. I could talk a lot about everything. But I would say, I feel like so I said my presentation that we do community engagement with everything here in Lowell, and I think that's a shift we've started to move into just within the past few years. But we've moved towards it so powerfully that now it's just sort of elemental in our planning process. But I think when we started to make that shift a few years ago, we were encouraged to kind of think outside the box a little bit in terms of community partners we engage with and how you engage with community, like capital C community. How do you do that? Do you just go to random people outside? Like, I don't know, but we kind of adopted a model of seeking out organizations that serve communities, like mutual assistance associations. We had an acting chief who was an intergovernmental detail appointee or something like that. So she was sort of borrowed from another organization. And she was coming to us from the Community Health Center. And she was a woman of color kind of appointed as our chief for a few years. And she really steered us in a more community inclusive direction. And she encouraged us to think outside the box, right? Like, so how might a historic park that's known for mill girls, like, be able to work with a community health center? Like, that seems sort of out of the box, but that really leads to some great engagement and some great conversations with partners. So I would encourage people to think outside the box, think of organizations in your immediate surrounding area if you want to do community work. I also come to this with a background as a community organizer. So I think about a term that's known as asset-based organizing, asset A-S-S-E-T. So, there's a lot of models of looking at doing community work, and some of it is like needs-based organizing, right? You can look at a group and say, very easily, oh, this is what I think they need, kind of thing. But it's a lot harder to think about, what are they offering? What are they bringing? And thinking about what can your visitors bring? That's kind of the foundation for a lot of audience-centered programming that the Park Service is moving towards. What knowledge do your visitors have that they can add and enrich an interpretive conversation around? But also apply that to your community. What knowledge, what skills, what resources do your surrounding community organizations or community members have, and how can you work together to create something really magical? So there's a lot more resources out there about asset-based organizing. There's an organization called Groundwork, which the National Park Service partners with at the top WASO level, and they have some great resources about asset-based organizing to look into. So I recommend checking it out and trying to apply that thinking to your work.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one? All right, well then I'll ask maybe a bigger question. We've gotten to this a little bit in the course of presenting. The question is, what would it take to make inclusive and nuanced women's history kind of durable and permanent in the National Park Service? One theme that's come out that I think is really important is related to labor, is related to a lot of this work having been done by people working on a temporary basis or a volunteer basis, or in positions without a lot of decision-making power. And I think that's really important, and I want to lift that up for sure. But I'm curious about what other insights we've all taken from kind of doing this work in a context where women's history was elevated to a pretty high priority, and what would it look like to keep that going into the future?
I think one of the big themes that have already been touched on is this idea of having the support that's needed to kind of delve into the research, and because I think when you're trying to highlight these hidden histories, it takes a little bit of extra research. And I think Talia and Jade and a lot of other members of this panel can speak to that. It's not just conducting the research and doing the writing. Oftentimes you're trying to look for sources that don't exist, or you're trying to interpret buildings as the sources. So it does take an extra level of research to kind of bring out these stories. And, most of the folks who were involved in creating the website, from the NPS 19th Amendment Centennial Coordinator to myself, to our interns, are not permanent staff. So luckily we have the funding to be able to kind of do that research. But I would say a lot of the inclusive stories that are on the website are due to temporary labor. So I think that's definitely a need.
Thanks, Katie. And I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about also in just reflecting on this question is kind of the question of what the public demands and what public expectations are. I mean, I think that in the context of the Suffrage Centennial, it was clear that the public was interested in a much more diverse and nuanced history of the suffrage movement. But I'm interested in how we think about maybe the dynamics of providing programming that then drives visitor interest, or how we respond to visitor demand for women's and gender history in the future, and how those kind of might come into play in terms of what is possible, what gets funded. That's sort of a vague question, but if anyone wanted to weigh in on that. And please, for our audience members, if you have thoughts on this, I'd welcome you jumping in the chat.
I just want to give a small plug that if you're at a National Park Service site and you're seeing that a diverse history is not represented, comment cards actually go way farther than you think. We had a volunteer who was referring to Indigenous people as primitive. And we were not on that tour as a Park Service staff, and we got a comment card about it, which immediately gave us the grounds to say, we need to do better education with our volunteers about how we refer to this nuanced culture and the traditional ecological knowledge that helped shape our forest. So if you're at a Park Service site, don't diminish your own role in helping our agency push forward.
All right, so we have just about 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna take some of the questions that have come to us through the Q&A. Again, please continue to drop those in. Wait, let me just advance my slide first. Oops. Now we moved on to the what do you think portion, but I do wanna leave up our contact information here. I think Elizabeth dropped her contact information into the chat and also a link to the webinar that she mentioned. And I believe that the video that Porsha shared is also in the feed loop chat. But in case you have any follow-up questions about anything we've talked about, we wanted to make our contact information available. But first, I'm gonna pull some of these questions from the Q&A. From Katie Woods, a couple of questions that I think are aimed at Katie, Jade, and Talia. One of them says, with all the online digital content, how have you advertised this information? And I guess this applies to everyone actually. And how is the public engaged with the content? Have you been able to track engagement or receive comments or feedback?
Yeah, I can just kind of start this question off. So when the centennial of the 19th Amendment planning began, the NPS National Coordinator worked collaboratively with parks and programs across the service to convene working groups to ensure that this was a park and program, effort, and that we were kind of unified in our approach. And one of those working groups included collaborating with the Office of Communications in DC, which is kind of like the National Park Service office that spearheads our messaging and our content promotion. So they were kind of involved from the very beginning stages. So when we would create content, myself and Talia and Jade, we would let them know, and they would often do either social media or press releases. So anything that rose to like national level content that needed to be rolled out. So that was kind of our main way of promoting at least the content related to the Women's History website. We also kind of explored other avenues. So for example, on the Women's History website, there's a great section with essays written by historians in the field. And so while that content is available digitally on the website, we also worked with Eastern National, one of our partners, to make that content into a handbook that was then made available at gift stores in parks. So that was another way of getting some of our content from the website out to the public. There was also a congressional commission for the 19th Amendment Centennial that we worked closely with to help promote our content. So some of our content was featured on their websites because they were kind of the national driving force behind that. So that kind of speaks to at least some of the effort that went behind it early on in the process in terms of our digital content on the Women's History site.
I'll ask Katie another follow-up question from Katie Woods, who's curious to learn more about the story map. Can you share more about the process of determining the sites for each state?
Yeah, sure. So the process for that is interesting. I think Jay did a good job of trying to describe how to go about creative inclusive histories that do take a place-based approach, since everything we do for the Park Service has to be grounded in either parks or sites affiliated with the National Park Service. So for that, I predominantly looked at the Library of Congress. They have a really great collection of like NASA, for example, which was a suffrage organization, a lot of their pamphlets that includes the cities where these conferences met, for example. So we were actually able to dig through some of those archives that were already digitized online and find places where these women were meeting. We also identified women who were connected with the suffrage movement and looked through some of their, whether it be autobiographies or sources they created, letters, to try to find where they were working and how they were doing this research. And so once we kind of identified the people in the cities they were in, we tried to see if those places were listed on the National Register. And it was actually really astounding. I grew really frustrated throughout the process because so many sites affiliated with these stories have been demolished. And again, because we are place-based, we really do have to ground it to place. So if the place isn't there and it's not listed, there's not a whole lot we can do. We try to be creative in finding places that have connections to the Park Service. But that is one of the major challenges in trying to tell inclusive histories connected with suffrage or just in general. And I'll let Jade and Talia speak to that process too.
Yeah, I would just add to that like Katie said, it does get really challenging, especially because so many buildings have been demolished or very frequently burned down as well, which is one of the most frustrating things for me. So when we're trying to be creative, we sometimes think about other Park Service programs that we could connect it to, properties that is. So for example, sometimes we'll look to see if the city is part of the Certified Local Governments program, which is another Park Service program partnering with local communities beyond just looking at the National Register. But it is something that's difficult. A lot of it is just based on primary source research, trying to find these places where people were. But it's really tricky, but I think it's worth it in the end.
Thank you. So we've just got about 5 minutes left. So I'm gonna, probably this will be our last question, but it's a really good one. So I wanna give us some time to discuss it. So Angela Duffett asks, says, hello from a Parks Canada historian based in Ottawa. I'm struck by the variety of different roles and job titles involved in these projects and the dependence on temp labor, which I see in my own workplace too. Could you tell us a little more about the relationship between the NPS historians, rangers, and interpreters? How do you work together on projects? This is a great question. And I think, partly why it's a great question is that the relationships can be a little bit ad hoc. So just, for example, just to clarify, Jade and Katie and I all work together, not physically anymore, but in the same office where Talia was also an intern last summer. But other than that, we've been connected to each other kind of in different ways. So Elizabeth reached out to me for some research assistance last summer. I'm a women's history fellow, so I had made myself available for women's history research, and I'm very grateful to say took the initiative to reach out to me about a project that she was working on. So we got connected that way and have worked together since. But I think others can speak to that. I know one really important driver in this was embedded in the 19th Amendment Centennial planning process. So my previous supervisor, Megan Springate, who was the 19th Amendment Centennial coordinator, helped facilitate working groups that were working on planning around this. And I know Resi was part of that effort. But if others would like to talk about maybe what your experience has been kind of trying to make these connections, I think particularly among those of us, including Porsha, who work in national level offices, getting connected with people working in parks sometimes is difficult. There are some internal tools to communicate that, but I would love to see more of it. And I hope this can be a starting point. But if others want to speak to that, that would be great.
I think I want to echo what Elizabeth mentioned earlier. So you asked about historians, and I think the formal job title of historian that is kind of based in the park unit is becoming much more rare in the National Park Service, is my sense. And I say this because my park used to have an official park historian person. They retired. There hasn't been anyone hired in that position since. I've applied to be a park historian for another national park, and then when I got there was told, actually no, you'll be doing frontline work, kind of thing. So yeah, I know it was a big surprise when I got there. So I think that, just to echo what Elizabeth said, that if there are any park managers on this call, or supervisors, or people who supervise frontline staff at your site, whether it's a park site or not. Oftentimes, if you want to be telling inclusive stories that are different than what you already have, that labor is going to be going to your frontline staff if you don't have an in-house park historian, which is becoming much more rare. And so I really want to echo what Elizabeth said, that if you want this research and you don't have a person to do it in the terms of like a capital H historian person, you know, you have to give your frontline staff that time and the resources to do that work. I would definitely say that. I was able to do a lot of research, but archives aren't always located by your site. Like the closest one that I went to a lot was Schlesinger Library at Harvard. So Cambridge is about an hour away from where I work. And if my supervisor only gave me 2 hours worth of time to do research, that would just be spent getting there and back. So you definitely need to like sometimes you have to make those hard calls of like, can we, you know, change our operating hours, or can we offer one list for that day? So, you know, this person can go do research. If you really want these stories, you have to prioritize the means of getting them. But yeah, that's enough for me.
Thanks so much. As we were in the waning seconds of our presentation, is there anything else anyone would want to jump in on really quickly?
I just want to say that my interpretation is so much better through my partnerships with historians. And so that connection is not to be understated.
Thanks so much. Well, that's about our time. Thank you all so much for attending today and taking time out of your Saturday. We really appreciate your time. Our contact info is here. I think you should also be able to get in touch with most of us through Feedloop, but please do if you want to talk more. Sadly, our post-session coffee opportunities are limited, but thank you again. Thanks to our panelists for their time, and see you soon. Thanks.